Um, so I just want to share what we've learned on our own site, which is 10 acres in the Mad River Valley for the last 11 years, and also what's emerging on our new farm, which is a larger scale, more of a true farm rather than a homestead, which is in central, it's about 40 minutes south, in central Vermont, which is a 175-acre site, where we're scaling up what we've been doing for getting on 11 years now in Moortown in the Mad River Valley. And where we are there is actually, it's 10 acres, but everything we're doing there, for the most part, can be done on 3 acres. 3 to 5 acres, 99% of what we're doing there can be done if you just have a few acres. If you have 1 acre, you can still do almost most of it, at least, let's say, 75 to 80%. So don't be fooled by, well, I don't have 10 acres, I can't do this. You can still do most of it on a much smaller acreage than that. That's important to remember. We're not really using half of our site very much at all, except for the odd lumber harvest, because it's cliffy and marginal, really marginal land. We're on land that is would never be considered farmland today. There's boulders and ledge everywhere. If you ran a tractor more than about 20 feet, unless you got really lucky, you'd break whatever you were dragging behind it. It's not ag soil. There was 10 to 12 inches of silty loam there. The soil maps are not wrong, and that's what they say for our site. And now there's about 0 to 2 inches, because that's the result of the last 200 years of land use in New England. Is we've lost, the elevation of New England has dropped a foot or 2 or 3, depending where you are, in the last few hundred years because of our land use, and because we're on a slope, so we've lost most of our topsoil across most of the landscape. There's still some down in the floodplains where 90+% of our food production is in the 10% of land that is considered, 10 to 15% that's considered ag soil, and almost all that is down in the floodplain. So what we're working on is how to garden and farm and do ecological restoration on the rest of the landscape, on what's most of New England, but also what's most of the world, because most of the world isn't, deep soil, low sloping land. Obviously, it's important we use that well, but what do we do with the rest of it? This is what the site is beginning to look like in the last handful of years. It's a place where we're not just growing food, but we're growing a lot of medicine, where we're harvesting water, where we're building soil, where there's a very robust ecosystem developing, much more diverse ecosystem than was there when we got there. Yet it's also kind of side yielding a lot of values to the people, not just the frogs and the bird life and the pollinators and everything else, but where we're getting a lot of high value medicinal crops, food crops, and as well our fuel. That's a big thing I'll chat about. So they need to stay warm. And this site is the main site I'll talk about is a homestead focus. The goal is not to turn anything on the land into food, into money there. It's to turn it into basic needs first, and whatever we have as a surplus to sell. So like this last week, I took maybe 6 dozen duck eggs to some local markets. But we're not raising those ducks to do that. It's not I think it's hard to find a good value exchange between turning land into money. So that's not our main focus. We do that when there's a surplus, however. Especially on a small marginal piece of land, that trade is even harder to come by, where there's a positive value. Most of when we get a surplus off the land, it doesn't necessarily make it worthwhile to go burn 2 gallons of gas to drive 20 minutes each way to bring 5 pounds of anything to a market. From an energy perspective, of course, it's just crazy that we do that, but we do while the gas that 20 pounds of material we're burning up in the car is a lot less valuable than the 5 pounds or maybe even 100 pounds we're bringing to market. So these are just some shots of the site to start off. It's an integrated system, as I'm sure many of you know. We're not just growing one thing in one spot and one thing in another. The idea is to grow them all overlaid with one another. So when people come to the farm and they're like, well, where's the pasture? It's like you're standing in it. This is the pasture. This is where we grow our fruits. This is where we grow sometimes even our veggies. We're trying to integrate perennial cropping for the most part with grazing, all while harvesting as much solar energy and water that falls from the sky as possible, to then transform that into as much value as possible for the longest period of time possible, right? That's permaculture. That's just regenerative land use. And also very resilient land use. I just want to talk about context here for a moment because it's important that we're all on the same page with that. We're all working on this, whether you're doing this kind of work or anything else. The context is that we happen to live in just 2-3 generations into an experiment of converting a society of production and transforming that into a society of consumption, replacing production with consumption, right? Literally paving over working landscapes for this kind of pattern. Now, it may not be this intense here in Williston, but it's pretty close. It's the same pattern, right? It's the same one-way linear flow of energy that we know can't last forever or even for very long. But that's just what we're working in. That's our context, and so it's very important to understand that, right? For the most part, beef doesn't come to most people, at least in this country and increasingly in the world, through grazing systems anymore. This is what it looks like, right? This is where most eggs and chickens are raised, although it's hard to even call them chickens now because of how engineered these units of production is how the industrial mindset sees life now. So this is where we are, right? It's amazing that eggs can even be made in this way, that a bird will produce an egg. It's a real testament to how resilient life is. More context, right? Has anyone heard of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico? This is where they start, right? Anyone know what this is? It's a feedlot, right? It looks kind of just like an abstract painting, but it's just a feedlot from space. That's where the nutrients go and the antibiotics and the pharmaceuticals. To the right there, that's a big algae bloom and a concentration of a lot of other gnarly stuff, much worse than algae, of course, makes its way down to the Gulf of Mexico where it chokes out almost every living thing where that outflow is.
On the left, our left is the squares.
Yeah, those are all cows, all those little...
Those are cows.
Yeah, those are all beef cows, right? And so this is where the food for the beef cows comes from, right? To here, goes to the right, and then out to the Gulf of Mexico, right? It's the one-way flow of resources. Totally dead end, right? It can't work, but it can for a little while energy is cheap. And we've just masterminded how to do this. Of course, at least while energy is flowing, it is very inexpensive. But of course, the cost, besides ecological, is really a human health cost. We know the cost is in species, but it's also in almost more intensely in the cost of our own health or lack thereof, right? We're in this amazing position of spraying chemicals on our food that no one would ever say are edible just to keep them producing, right? It's really phenomenal. So that's just where we're at. And the social cost also is impossible to wrap our minds around, right? Because you can't do this without cheap energy. You got to get the cheap energy somewhere. The cheap energy just doesn't flow off the hillsides all over the world. It's only in a small number of places. So we have to go get it. And it's important context. I don't say this to depress us, but I bring it up because it drives the rate of change that we'll see in our lifetime. And as we're entering the second part of the oil age, the important thing to take home here is that the rate of change that we'll see in our lifetime is probably many, many times the rate of change that we saw in our parents' lifetime or in our grandparents' lifetime. Because the whole movement towards cheap energy and mining out, literally salvaging, just scavenging, humans as large, mega-scale industrial scavengers of ancient resources is just getting going. This is the oil age part 2 here. Anyone know where this is? Tar sands, right. And this is mega-scale. These tar sands are over a huge portion of the earth. And I bring this up because the old adage, if you don't change direction, you'll get where we're headed, right? Well, we're headed is this direction, at least from a industrial standpoint. There's really no resistance to this among leadership at the national or international scale. We'll probably, if we haven't already, there'll be that pipeline going through the United States now to ship the energy off to China. Even though we had a total we thought we had a change in administration, what was it, 6 years ago. It's the same direction, right? We're actually running there faster than ever. So the consequences of this will keep mounting. I mean, when I was in college, I was right here in class not too long ago in this crazy building. And I thought, well, at some point in the next 5 years, we'll turn this ship around and we'll have all this old debt to repay ecologically and socially. But we'll switch directions. We're not at all. And I know that's totally depressing. It's very sad. But the important thing to understand about that is that we have to design for that. We have to really look at that in the face and say, okay, how are our systems going to deal with this rate of change, this level of toxicity, this rate of climate impact, and also this rate of economic impossibility? Because we know we can't keep going in this direction for a very long time on the whole without the economics of it not panning out, right? This is where all the shale gas is. Hopefully it's not really there, but we'll frack it all out if it is. Again, unless we change course 180 degrees. The climate impact we know is starting to get all really whacked out. Whether it's this or just volcanoes going off naturally, the climate's always shifting. This is between 1990 and 2006. You guys have probably seen this map, some of you. This is Arbor Day Foundation. The USDA hasn't updated their maps just yet. We see Zone 3 is basically moved out of Vermont, and the other zones marching northward. There's problems to this, right? Malaria, Lyme disease, everything's moving north. Pests are all switching around. But so are there also opportunities. We now grow peaches where I live, which we couldn't have done 20, 30, 50 years ago, except rarely every now and then on some years. We're mostly Zone 5 where I live now. We've only seen one Zone 4 winter in Moortown, at least where I am in Moortown, in 10 years, where it's been below negative 24, below negative 25 or below, truly Zone 4. It's been Zone 5, so we're a zone warmer. There's dozens of more useful, highly valuable species you can grow in Zone 5, 6, 7 than you can in Zone 4, 3, 2, 1 as you get colder. In order to hedge our bets here, we're planting species from climate zone 1 to 7 because we know it's never consistent that we're going to hang out in one climate zone. We all should do that unless we want to gamble on the climate just staying the same, which we shouldn't do even if it was 500 years ago. We shouldn't make that gamble because the climate's always been doing this. That's, inherent in the understanding of climate is changing. Climate change is kind of a funny term. It's like a non sequitur. Yeah, that's what climates do is they change. They stay consistent for a little while. They're consistent enough in the last 10,000 years. Scholars think that that's actually why civilization could emerge, that they had to be very consistent. The Earth's climate's been inconsistent enough for a very long time that civilization, it was too much impacts to the system. We couldn't form civilization. It was too crazy on planet Earth. And finally, after things, if you look at the emergence of civilization, it coincides in a very parallel way with a mellowing and a stabilization of climate. Well, it may just be civilization that causes the climate in part to destabilize again. That's kind of cool in some ways, right? There'll be major suffering. It's not a totally cool thing, but it's kind of a big karmic circle, right? That our climate's unhinged by the same thing that a stable climate, relatively stable climate, needed to be in place before we could establish human civilization, right? We know 350 parts per million are where apparently a lot of the science says we need to be. We're talking a lot about let's get to 350, but let's also talk about what happens when we get to 1,000, because that's where we're going, or 500, or 750, whatever you name it. Now, a lot of people say, oh, this is impossible. We get above 350, we start going into here, we're all toast. We're done. Should we just give up? Right? Because we're going there. So how do we design for these systems? How do we say, okay, this is going to be crazy. How do we create the most robust human, social, ecological, soil building, water harvesting, climate, chaos, adaptable human habitat systems? That's what we're working on. That's what permaculture is all about. So, right, you see a pattern here. You don't have to read any of the headings of this. If you can't make out a pattern here, maybe look a little harder, right? This is the pattern. This is the part of the life cycle of complex systems we can't spend too much time in, no matter what your politics or religion. We can all agree on one thing. You just can't hang out right here for too long. It doesn't last right there. That's where we are, right? Easy to think this is peak disaster. Oh, just throw in the towel. enjoy a powder day, go chill in the Caribbean because, you know, life's short, civilization's short. But and I say I recommend doing that a little bit for sure. But because remember the comet's always going to come. This whole thing will be vaporized at some point, so don't worry too much. Really, I mean, it will. We'll get hit by a comet again, and just press reset, and in a few million years, there'll be a lot of cool stuff again. That's totally good to remember. There's no real need to stress about it all. We're just nothing in the universe, and that's fine. But we like people. I love, polar bears and everything. It's all really beautiful, and it's all here, and that's a good thing. So let's see this craziness as peak opportunity too, right? Because life is good, and life wants to live, and there must be some wisdom in that. So let's do what we can to help it out. And that's also really, really fun and really invigorating. I personally find it's about the only thing I don't get bored of is trying to promote living things where I live. Everything else I've mostly gotten bored of. So this is maybe something that we can attach ourselves to for the long haul. It's compelling. For us doing this work, we've had to start looking in the last 5 to 7 years around the world at similar climates. It's important we all understand the idea of climate analogs. Right? Where is a similar climate to where you live, whether it's Virginia or Ohio or New York City or Vermont? Where is a similar climate, and what have people been doing there for a long time? Because chances are they figured out more things than we figured out here in North America. At least than our modern last few centuries has figured out. There's been incredibly sophisticated, enduring land use here for probably 4,000 to 10,000 years before Europeans got here, but we wiped a lot of that off the map. If you're interested in those systems, check out Charles Mann's book, 1491, among others, because he talks a lot about what was going on here. Probably, as far as we can tell, was a continental scale forest garden. Really amazing. A lot to learn there. But in other parts of the world, some of these systems are still in existence. You can still see them a little bit. So we look across this line of climate analogs, and it's not a line of equal latitude. That's important to remember. We're not in southern France. Totally different. There's global air and ocean currents that just make our climate do this kind of curve. And in parts of the world, along this blue line, there are systems that have been in existence for not just hundreds, but for thousands of years. Meanwhile, we got, the last few hundred years, we've developed a system that can only persist, a food system that is totally annual-based, tillage-based, and can only exist with massive free energy inputs, cheap energy inputs. Right? The Midwest won't run without fossil fuels. It won't be productive. There's no, in the current method, right? There's no output. There's no bushels, billions of bushels of corn and wheat and soybeans without that. So we managed to figure out a system that doesn't work. What does work? What does work around the world? And to also understand, as we look at climate analogs, what this place is, and as anyone who's traveled understands, when you come back home, you start to look at your own place with fresh eyes and actually see what it is a little more clearly. And when I've done that, I've come back to realize that this place where we live, this is right down the road from my house, this is a class 4 road that gets graded once every year or two, is actually, we live in an incredibly resilient place, one of the most resilient in the world. What happens to this road if we stop just running heavy machinery on it every year? It becomes the forest again, yeah. There's already more roads through Vermont than there are now in existence. There already were those roads built in the past. If you've walked around the hills of Vermont, you see them. They're usually next to stone walls, they lead to old foundations, and they're everywhere. We live in a place that mulches itself every year. Right? And it's wet enough and in a consistent enough way that soil wants to build here, much more than in the rest of the world, in most of the rest of the world. Right? This is what we did in New England and also most of the world. Right? We didn't have gold, but we had timber. We logged it all out. I remember learning right here on this campus what we did in Vermont, and I was surprised. We cut down all the trees, like 90+%. Right? Go look for old growth. It's in a handful of spots. This is the White River, actually. If you know South Royalton, there's a great swimming hole right here now, right where these guys are standing on those logs. Mountain of logs was all logged out, and I remember thinking, well, who replanted all the trees? No one replanted the trees, right? They all replanted themselves, for the most part. There's a few plantations, but the whole landscape replanted itself. Now, it's much worse off. It's not a forest with chestnuts and and healthy beech trees and a lot of other, and it's important to remember we had a forest where the sugar maples were like from me to the wall here, all over the place. Many of these sugar maples, 6-8 foot diameter, and those were understory trees below chestnuts. We can't, we don't understand that. We don't see it. Every now and then you can see a remnant of a stump like that. And our kids won't see those remnants even. If we go back to our grandparents, they could say they might have seen some of them even still alive cut down. So we're impoverished. Our landscape is not just natural right now, it's degraded. We have an opportunity to move towards not just what used to be in terms of health and robustness and beauty and complexity and maturity, but also hopefully to even go beyond that, because we know some things now we didn't know before. But the point here is we cut down all our trees, all the trees grew back. That's a resilient tendency of our landscape. What happens most of the world, you cut down your trees, you end up with a desert, right? Deforestation and desertification are the same process. Actually, in a lot of the world, you cut down just some of your trees and you make a desert. All right? We know what that's like. That's the story of civilization. The Fertile Crescent had large forests in it. The Middle East was forested. Really, it was actually forested. I mean, it's hard to imagine because we just know it's been a desert for a while, for a lot of human generations, but not for most of time. Right? So this is the last bit of forest in these dry areas. And then when you desertify these, you deforest these lands, it takes someone who's a real genius like Jeff Lawton or some other people to actually bring health back to them. It takes very ingenious strategies to, nothing we can't do. We can reforest these areas, actually. It's amazing, the power for regeneration. But it's much more difficult than regenerating Vermont and less brittle climates. And I bring this up to understand, so we all kind of have a sense of what are the tendencies here? Why is this landscape so resilient? Well, it has everything to do with water and its distribution. For the most part, water comes very evenly into New England, right? We get 3 to 6 inches of rainfall equivalent per month most of the year. Now, we might not get rain really for a month and then get 8 inches or 20 like we did last June. But for the most part, it's very even, and that's why our climate is so non-brittle. It's the evenness of moisture distribution, not the overall amount of moisture distribution. There's much more brittle climates that get 80 inches of rain a year. Monsoonal climates, they get the 80 inches in 2 months or a month, and then it doesn't rain. A lot of the world plays by much stiffer rules than we do here. That's difficult. That's a place that can break very easily. We live in a place that's like this, and most of the world's like this. I lived in the Bahamas even, and it's very easy to destroy that landscape. We got all the rain in the monsoon there, and then almost no rain from midwinter till the hurricane season started again. So that's challenging, and we still know how to work in those places. How do we work here? Our biggest challenge is shocks to the system, right? This is Hurricane Irene 2 some odd years ago. Right before the power went out, I got this screenshot, and this is the amount of water flowing through. People like Dorothy Todd know this well. Her house got bulldozed that day. She's about 10 miles upriver from where I live. So this is in Moortown, right here. It turned into a Himalayan scale river, a pissed Himalayan scale river, right? And this is a factor of, for math folks, I think what is a factor of 100? This is 100 times. This went from 80 cubic feet a second to over 20,000. That's, I think, is a factor of 100. And that's thousands of times the volume, right? But what I want to put out there is this is just a natural event. Now, does human meddling cause these events to happen more often? Sure, probably. But it's also natural. Hurricane Irenes have been happening since forever, right? I mean, actually, this river did much crazier things when the ice was melting 10,000 years ago. That's where we mine out the gravel pits nowadays. The gravel pits hundreds of feet tall. You imagine what the rivers did then. There wasn't anyone making settlements in that time. It was too difficult, right? So, but what we should also measure this in is in dump truck loads of soil per minute, right? It should be DTPS or DTPM, right? That's the consequence. That's why this is a problem, right? It's not a big deal to have. Well, it's also a problem if you live down a floodplain. Sorry, but the fact that we're conveyor belting out value that took thousands of years to accumulate in the hills, soil, organic matter, and we're losing it in the space of hours. What took thousands of years, and we're saying, okay, whew, that's gone. That's in Lake Champlain. Now, we're probably not going to get it back from the bottom of Lake Champlain. That's the problem, right? We can design settlements. We should not live in floodplains. It's not a big deal. I mean, we'll probably have to, eventually we'll move out of the floodplains. We'll have to. We'll move our towns out of the floodplains. It's not a big deal. A lot of the world has known that for a while. But we can't afford to lose. So this is the loss of civilization you can see in this river. It's done it over and over again. Right? This is up on my farm at the same time. I'll talk about this in a minute, where no soil was being moved. I was amazed. This was our first test event of what a water-holding landscape can do. This is down in our village. The fire station's right back over here is the first building flooded. It's the lowest building in our town. It's an interesting strategy from an emergency management standpoint. You know, we're just not thinking about what the earth does in our daily planning or lack thereof. Right, here's our post office. This is about 6 p.m. before the flood actually crested quite a bit higher. This is where all that soil went, right? Our very large stormwater detention basin called Lake Champlain. And it's deep because if it wasn't very deep, you could just kind of hop across to the Adirondacks on mounds. Like it'd be one big swamp, right? Because we put a lot of soil down there. And it's difficult to get it back from the lake. So meanwhile, up on our farm, we had a very different story. And this is the first real example of how robust, for me personally, of what a swaled, paddied, ponded, water-slowing landscape can do. Where a landscape where we're slowing, spreading, and sinking water, SSS, what this can do. This wasn't the best day these sheep ever had. You know, they're like pretty wet, but not, you know, maybe a lot like Iceland where their heritage is. But then up on our farm, they had an okay time of it. This is what the river looked like. Few bits of soil moving there, and then up on our farm. The bottom settling pond is getting hundreds of gallons a minute right now after about 5 inches of rain in Hurricane Irene, and there's no silt in it. It's totally clear water. Even though, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of gallons of water have landed on this landscape in the last 12 hours. We're not moving any soil. I'll narrate this a little further. This is the last part of our system, the bottom of our land. And I figured I'd go down there and
it's good for the land. This storm's good for this farm.
Some material.
While it's washing out.
And I realized that actually
a lot of other farms,
large storm,
and houses,
there wasn't a speck of soil that was in the Mad River.
Infrastructure, bridges,
and actually,
roads.
Off of
here's the last swale coming in.
We catch that much water as well. And I was amazed because there was
beautiful water.
Some of that landscape actually does move.
Beautiful rainwater from the ocean.
They do things that
this is probably after.
This is the water flowing in. You can see right here.
Oh, about.
And it blew
better
me
part
away
of a
because
mile of
it made me
swales.
realize
This
that
water's
actually
already
even
traveled
if soil
through to get
does start
here, and
moving on the
it's
hills,
been through.
It can get recaptured over and over
maybe,
again if you give enough.
Well, a lot of it's been through at least 2 ponds. Some of it's been through 3. Some of it's been through 1. Some of it's been through rice paddies, and all of it's been through swales.
You give it enough opportunity to settle back out. So whatever happens, we're not losing that soil out forever to Lake Champlain, unless we mount some big dredging operation, which sounds expensive, to get that soil back. I'll talk about this in detail here in a minute, but I just want to look at some strategies from around the world that don't lose soil, that don't require a heavy amount of inputs, and can persist until that comet comes around again. Right, so here is the north part of the South Island of New Zealand. This is a highly profitable farm growing kiwis, of course, hops, which is big. This is outside of Nelson. Has anyone been down there? Nelson, northern part. Beautiful area, amazing climate. You can grow basically everything we grow, plus the whole Mediterranean suite of foods. I never knew a climate like this actually existed. And they're doing things very smartly here, right? They have their crops, peaches, cherries, plums, apples, pears, a whole bunch of other stuff, all grown in these protected windrows, which are also productive crops in of themselves. right? So what happens in this situation? You have, if south is to the left, you have super warm microclimates forming in places like this, in these north sides of each cell. You have cool areas to the north of the hedgerows, to the south sides of each cell. You have wildlife habitat, animals that can run from here through all of these hedges. You have ecosystem services like that. You have what happens when water lands up here and has to move downhill through this system compared to water landing up here, right? Instead of free flow movement down the slope, water is intercepted 1,001 times in this productive landscape. Evapotranspirates, infiltrates back down into the ground, right? It's a three-dimensional, highly productive, high resiliency, high diversity landscape versus a two-dimensional landscape that most of New Zealand, actually, I was amazed, was doing, oversheeping, just not overgrazing, but grazing poorly, because this kind of landscape can be grazed as well. And actually, this landscape I was seeing in the north, in much of the central part of New Zealand, was already creating arid climates, was already desertifying their land. I went to look at what I thought would be kind of sophisticated grazing, and I actually saw crazy grazing. I saw people irrigating pasture, which, where we are, would be like, what are you doing? You all right? You're watering your acres and acres of grass because things are drying out so much, because they're wholesaling their trees, liquidating their forests, and they're on their third or fourth cycle of Pinus radiata, just monoculture mining. And they don't have as much of a resilient landscape to do that in. We do here, at least for now, and there were already drainages that drained thousands of acres, which were dry creek beds, like arroyos, in their spring, at the beginning of their spring, which should be raging, being able to kayak down. So it was incredible. That was a real rarity in New Zealand, unfortunately. Here's another example of an agro-ecosystem, of a naturalized farming system that's human-made. This is anthropogenic. No one, this just didn't exist. People planted these trees. This is a nuttery. This is actually at an arboretum where it wasn't planted for agricultural purposes. But this is how nutteries look around the world. I'll show you some other photos of them in parts of Europe. We don't have examples of this in this country for the most part right now. People like Mark Shepard are pretty far along in creating this. Another 100 years, 200 years, and they'll start to look like this. But here's a system that requires no tillage, no fertilizer inputs. We say in permaculture, no one fertilizes the forest, yet it keeps growing. How's that possible, right? A nut tree, like a big oak or a walnut or chestnut, can produce as much nutrients as a cow every year for 100, 200, 300 years with no one feeding the tree like a cow. It's worth paying attention to, right? That's pretty amazing. How does that work? Here's a system that inherently is protecting itself, right? It has a canopy buffering against the percussion of raindrops coming down, holding in moisture, shading its ground. You have roots going down dozens of feet if the bedrock isn't there. You have a system that's highly robust in the face of drought and flood, right? Because flood in the case of you have no tillage, you have no exposed soil, and drought in the case of root depth, and in case of it shading itself. For many reasons, you have a drought-resistant system here. It could not rain for a month or two, or even the whole growing season in New England, and oaks might still have a good year, right? Because it's still moist 5, 10, even 3, 4 feet down into the subsoil. What happens to an annual crop if it doesn't rain for even sometimes a month, right? Your tomatoes, your potatoes, your corn, right? Those aren't plants that have been working on the root system for 100 years, right? Just for even a month or two, right? Plants that we have to replant every year. This replants itself. No one has to actually replant this, certainly not every year. So it's worth seeing what are the principles, how does that system work, right? The challenge is how do we turn these into human yields? We know that they're more robust and more permanent and more resilient than annual cropping systems. But how do we actually turn this into something that is a food system and a medicine and a fuel system for humanity? We know how to do that, but it's not something we're used to seeing. We'll talk about that in a moment. Even where there's been annual cropping in parts of the world, people have actually, at times, especially in Southeast Asia and parts of Polynesia, and a few other areas, but those are the most striking examples, people have figured out how to grow even annual tilled crops, even tillage. Gasp, I know that's amazing. that tillage could be sustainable, but potentially it could be, but only if you reshape, only if you're catching, slowing, spreading, and sinking all of your water, if you're not losing any of your nutrients every year, or very little, right? So what people, I saw these photos growing up and throughout college, and I was like, wow, it's just amazing, it's so beautiful, but I didn't really get it until I started implementing these systems on my own landscape, and I didn't really realize that what these people were making the decision to do was to take generations of shaping these systems by hand, generations of digging. They didn't do these with excavators. They didn't have that available. They figured it was worthwhile to not have to fight gravity every year, to actually make these systems by hand, which took generations rather than for endlessly fighting the effects, the forces of entropy and gravity, and losing their soil every year. Let's just reshape the land to hold all of these nutrients and water, which is even more valuable than soil. It's really mind-numbing to think that these systems were made by hand, that people who have lived in a place for thousands of years figured this is the way towards permanence. So there's something to learn there. We don't have anything that looks like this yet in this country. And I think it's mainly because we haven't been here long enough. And then when we well, our first wave of land use, like in New England, failed. We left to the Midwest. That was the time of great abandonment in the late 1800s, mid-1800s, after the sheep craze. Went to the Midwest, where there was the best virgin soil in the world. We've mined that out now for what's just getting on a few generations, and we got fossil fuel inputs so we could keep that system going, using the soil simply as a media. It's really almost hydroponics. It's like chemical hydroponics, right? So we haven't had to figure these things out yet. I think if we're here in New England, in this country, in hill country, in another 100 years, or certainly another 1,000, and it might start looking like this, especially in Vermont. So I saw this photo a number of years ago and said to myself, wow, that could be Vermont. I've never seen anything like this in person, but there's snow on terraces. I thought all these things were tropical. And I realized then, a little around then, that we could do these things in this place as well. So my own farm started to become what friends joke is this kind of cross between Japan and Vermont. Maybe we call it Jamont, or a Jamontian form of land use. And it's kind of funny and interesting because I don't have any particular connection with Japan. I actually was planning to go before their tsunami and then ongoing nuclear catastrophe. But I never ended up going. And yet, here my own landscape as just an attempt to work with the system to fit our systems to the land in a way that seemed to actually function well for the long term has started to look like other landscapes in other parts on the other side of the world. It's interesting that pattern is emerging. So here's looking west on our farm towards the Long Trail Ridge, towards the main spine of the greens. There's Camel's Hump. We're in Moortown, northern Mad River Valley. You can see our paddies, our grazing, all of it's grazed, but you see the sheep here, some terrestrial terraces, squash being grown here. This is all grazed. Perennials all down below here. That's all mulberry and chestnuts, apples, hazelnut, currants, elderberry, and a bunch of other stuff planted down there, and a whole bunch of other stuff. I'll talk about what these are in a moment. Some of the principles I'll mention here. I won't read them off to you, but they're taken from my book, which has about 72 of them, I think. This book's available, by the way, from Chelsea Green here at the conference and on our website. This slideshow talks about 10 of these principles in particular. I won't read them off, but you can see an example of them here. And I'll probably put the slideshow online, and you can refer back to it. All right, so here's our 10 acres. And this is what was happening with the water when we moved there, wanting to run right off slope, right? Well, maybe 1,600 feet from top of the landscape, well, about 1,000 feet down to the bottom, dropping 150 feet or so in places. Now, a raindrop landing on top of this property has to go back and forth, and travel almost a mile, depending where it lands, to get off the land. Right? If you don't remember anything else from this presentation, I'd say that's one of the most important things, is what we're doing with water here, the idea of spreading pulses, and also thus fertility. And so getting the most out of the free energy that lands on your property that's the backbone of everything any good farmer is trying to do, right? Is transforming the free lunch into value, just even from an economic perspective, never mind ecological. Right, so what's free? Sunshine, rainfall, subsoil, hopefully, unless you're on straight up bedrock. Then bedrock's free. Use that as a resource, right? But so what happens when it rains is most of the time we lose all our water off the landscape. We'll visit properties and maybe even look around your own property and you see water running after a rainstorm onto the land and then off the land, and we don't think anything of it. What if you walked outside and there was compost flowing through your site? Visiting a friend's property and after it rained or composted, and there's compost running off the site. Do you think people will be like, oh, that's cool, yeah, that's the stream of compost. It's making its way onto the property and off. No, compost is everything, right? I mean, besides water, the more compost, the better, right? The more we can produce. You would try to slow it down, spread it out, and deliver it to all parts of the landscape that needed those nutrients. Well, amazingly, we do this with water all the time. We just see it run off the property. Water is more valuable than compost. If you can only have one or the other, you definitely go for water. That's why there's living life on this whole planet, right? Compost fertility is also valuable, but water is everything and then more, right? Water actually contains a high amount of fertility, and more fertility in rainfall now than since we've probably been walking upright because of all of our nitrogen pollution. We're putting more nitrogen into the atmosphere. It's coming back out in rain. So when everything greens up after a rainstorm, it's not just psychological. It's a fertilizing event every time it rains. So how are you going to use that as much as possible? Right? It's a nitrogen event happening every time it rains. So that's all about where water runs, make it walk, is a common phrase to understand this. Think of a landscape as intestines. And swales are the best example of intestines, right? So if you think about if we had intestines that went from our mouth right out the backside, would we get much nutrients? Would we extract much nutrient out of our food? Straight shot? No, right? It's all about back and forth, back and forth. It's all about surface area, interchange. The more surface area, all life is dependent on surface area and as much amount of interchange as possible. But that's what we're doing with our water system. That's the basis of regeneration on land. Is a high degree of interchange in the cycling every resource as many times on site as possible. And that starts with water. Right? If we don't do it with water, we're not doing it with our soil, that's for sure. Right? So the old organic farming mantra I love, and I used to be all about it. It's all about the starts and ends with the soil. It's all about the soil. Stupid, right? It's soil, soil, soil. Well, that's true. But first, it's about the water. If you don't manage your water first, you're not managing your soil well. And that's something that organic veggie growers, what I call conventional organic farmers, should take to heart. I don't mean to rip on anyone who grows a lot of veggies. It's very productive, but you got to ask yourself the question, what happens, walk around your farm and wherever you're standing, ask yourself, where's the water go when it lands on this spot? Right? Are you cycling it? Are you slowing, spreading, and sinking it? Right? I'm not saying veggies and tillage potentially doesn't even have a role. It doesn't have a role. It does. But if we're losing our water, it's a one-way flow. And that's to be avoided, also just purely from an economic standpoint alone. So here's what happens on most landscapes. On all landscapes, to some extent, especially if they're sloping, most water, when it hits a slope, depending on the degree of health of that slope, runs off. A lot of it, let's say. Most slopes, I would say, most of that water does run off. If indicated by the arrows, big arrows meaning high amounts of water flow, small arrows being less, very little infiltrates most slopes in a degraded landscape. As I said, we're mostly on degraded landscapes. If you check the water flow, so it has to slow down, spread out, and sink, all of a sudden you change the whole situation. The easiest way to check the water flow is to build a swale. It's the biggest bang for the buck. You can do it with ponds, you can do it with terraces, kind of, you can do it with paddies, but a swale is the easiest way to do it. You just make, on contour, on a line of equal elevation, you make a little ditch where water can sit and not rush off the slope. This is the easiest way to visualize it. And then all of a sudden, you completely change the behavior of how water interacts with that landscape, right? All of a sudden, water now has to spread out in that ditch behind the mound and sit there. When it sits there, it evaporates, it sinks into the soil in the mound and below and gets evaporated by the plants, and it also infiltrates back into the groundwater to recharge our most important water storage, which is our aquifers, one of our most important water storages. All right, so then this is the process. So first we identify the suboptimal condition, right? That's water moving off of the landscape. Not good. No one's benefiting from that. You're losing value if that's happening on your site. Structurally address the problem. That's structural. That's like a physical addressing of the problem. It's not tweaking. It's changing the whole situation. It involves an excavator or a bulldozer or handwork, but actually changing the shape of the earth, depending on scale, right? Then, once we've done that structural adjustment, the earth shape, that's the first layer, we can start adding the biology. That's the second layer. Too often we jump to this second step, which is adding the biology, the plants or the animals. But that comes after the structural adjustment, right? So first, when you get on a piece of land or walk around your own to assess it, look at the earth shape. That's the baseline, right? There's a thing called the Yeoman scale of permanence. Has anyone heard of that? Very important to understand. Check that out online if you're interested. This is one of the most important things you could look into is this Yeoman scale of permanence, the scale of permanence of how changeable different characteristics of a landscape are. And this guy, Pia Yeomans, who is this just genius farmer in Australia about 50, 60 years ago, realized this just such a basic understanding of landscape. It's amazing that no one articulated it earlier. Probably indigenous people have understood it for a long time, but didn't potentially articulate it to the modern world, that there are some things more permanent than others in terms of features of landscape. Climate is pretty permanent. The shape of the land is pretty permanent. What plants are there? The soil, actually, even, those are very changeable. So first address the things that are least changeable, and then go layer by layer down the scale of permanence. So first we change the shape of the land, then we add or address the shape of the land, then add biology. So we go from this suboptimal to structural adjustment to plant layer to grazing layer. And it can also, these two can swap. But what we usually do is plant the swales, and then we graze it. And then you're really cycling the carbon on site and creating quick cycling carbon pathways. You're basically turning atmospheric carbon and nitrogen into soil as quickly as possible when you layer this all together, from a water standpoint and from a biological plant and animal standpoint. It's from a soil food web standpoint. It's an example of just planting along the contour, not off contour, right? On contour just means a line of equal elevation. These swales aren't going up and down a slope, right? They're going across a slope. This is what these systems look like right after they're planted. This is a seaberry, plum, pear, hazelnut system. This is right after a rainfall. And we're looking southwest. You can see the water in there. If I came back 20 minutes later, the water was gone. All right, this is actually, and these swales were actually almost full right after the rainfall. We had like a 2-inch rain event. And what I've realized from our swales is that what we're doing on our 10 acres is that we can catch all of our rainfall in the growing season below a 4-inch rain event. When Hurricane Irene happened, it was only our bottom pond was 3 feet down when the storm came in, and that pond did not fill and water started running out the overflow of the pond until we were 2/3 of the way through the storm, till 4 inches of 6 had fallen. So the first 4 were all totally shock absorbed into the site. And now we actually have thousands of more feet, hundreds of more feet of swale on this property. So every lineal foot of swale you can think of as adding inches of travel to the shocks in your system. If you think about like the shock on a mountain bike, the bigger that shock, the more energy you can absorb. When you lay in swales, ponds, terraces, and patties, you're adding depth to that shock. And right now we're in a position where we can absorb everything on our acreage plus 25 acres above us, 4 inches or less, we can absorb all of it. And most of it even above 4 inches. We'll see. Maybe we'll get a rain event that's 8 inches. I hope not. Or 10 or 12. Some point we will, and we'll see what we can absorb then. But right now we're in a complete water storing standpoint. We're not contributing to any rise of the river on those 35 acres unless it rains more than 4+ inches. Imagine if we did that over our whole landscape, or even over a bunch of it, over our whole working landscape. What would the Mad River have gotten in Irene instead of 21,000 cubic feet per second? Maybe it would have been 18, 15, I don't know. But that's a flood mitigation standpoint as well as a working landscape strategy, these swales. There's a profound impact there in terms of flood control. So now the biological layer, this is the same place about a year and a half later, 2 years later, and the hazelnut's getting about 8 feet tall. The seaberries, you can see all the seaberry on them, and we're grazing it. And it's all about timing in here for these animals, Icelandic sheep, which you kind of like to browse, not to destroy these perennials. If they're left there long enough, they will. And there's an important principle there that everything that can be, any tool that can be, that can facilitate regeneration can also be a tool for destruction, right? Fire, water, animals, grazing. Grazing can destroy landscapes, and grazing can heal landscapes. Same with water, same with fire. All of these, it's all about timing. It's all about frequency and intensity of applying these tools. So that's the nuance here. That's very, very important, because people are very simple. We tend to be very simple-minded with these things. We think, oh, well, cattle have destroyed a good chunk of the world. Cattle are bad. No, that's just not how it works, right? There's a more subtle layer to that, right? There's nothing more soil building than intensive rotational grazing, as far as we can tell, for the most part. There's also nothing to destroy soil faster than a mob of cattle that are never moved on a site. Right, so we rotate these animals through quickly, quick cycling, high intensity grazing. And once we've started in with the animals, the lushification, the greenness, the amount of health that's come to the land has gone way up since before. We kind of didn't graze for about 5 years, and then we started grazing for about 5 years. And even when we brought ducks and chickens in, which was our first layer, the thickness of the sward of grasses and the greenness and how long it was green throughout the season and the rate of growth and the diversity all started to go way up, especially when we brought sheep in. I'll talk about that in a minute. This is making swales. A good principle here is, there's things you might do to establish a system that you don't want to do for the long haul. I don't certainly want to depend upon an excavator. I own a small excavator because we do this work for clients as well. But it costs a lot to own, and it's super energy intensive, and it's just not here for the long haul, right? But it can help us establish systems overnight that will last for thousands of years. So there's actions we'll take to establish a system that we deliberately won't want to depend on for the long haul. But think about a tractor farm. Without that tractor, you ain't farming, right? If you're tillage-based vegetable farming, that's a maintenance dependency. Okay, I'm okay, and I think there's a resiliency in using something to establish a system, but only if you don't depend on that mechanism for the long haul. And that's where I think right now we have an opportunity, we have a window into where we're at the tail end, at some point at the tail end of the cheap energy world, where these things are available. And I think of it as, use it or lose it, right? We can turn a gallon of fossil fuel into 1,000 feet of swale, or that gallon of fossil fuel be used up bombing people in Syria or wherever, right? Or on a trip to the mall, and you didn't end up with swales, right? That's kind of what it comes down to. I mean, when I got this landscape, I was pretty fresh out of college. Like, we're going to do all this by hand. And I realized, okay, that will work, and we'd have the system that we have now in 50 years, or 30, or 20. And the oil would still be burned up, right? It's a big conversation to have. But I think it'll be hard to explain to our kids, if they're digging all day, every day for months on end, why, what'd you do with your oil, right? What'd you do with it when you guys had it, right? Because these things are permanent. There's earthworks that are in place from 10,000 years ago in parts of Asia. We'll outlive all of us, all of our buildings, and everything else. The earthworks are the most permanent infrastructure. So they're very easy to justify investing in, right? Work out that, that compounded value over 5,000 years. Until the ice sheet rolls in again, we'll have these swales, right? Or the comet, that same comet again. Right, so here's swales at a larger scale. This is small scale. You can do this by hand if you have a good group of people pretty quickly too. We make the swales pretty tall because they tend to settle. You don't want to compact them. The idea is an infiltrating system. It's not a pond berm. It's very different. Here's a swale we made. We had a large excavator on site on our farm in Rochester, Vermont, and we're basically turning what is a depleted hayfield that's been hayed and hayed and hayed to death for the last 30, 40 years into what's still a hayfield, also grazed and also producing perennial polycultures in hedgerows on and just below the swales, where we're now catching all of the water instead of letting it rush off site. It'll still be hayed, and that's, I think, one of the neat parts about it. So this is making the system. We had a large excavator on site to dig a foundation, and so we just rented it for another month to dig these swales. It's really good if you have a tilt bucket to do swales this way. We do a lot of handwork. This is in our permaculture design course. Handworking about a 500-foot long swale here. This is what it looks like looking south now. This is during our permaculture course. Everyone's camping. We're planting a seaberry swale here. And then we rake in seed, and then we hay it and plant it all at the same time. You want to seed. Anytime you make bare soil, you want to seed it as soon as possible, right? Or you give an opportunity for weed seed and stuff that's just blowing around, dispersive things to come in. And also for lack of soil stabilization and erosion to happen. So we seed it right off the bat. I like to say heavy equipment should come with seed strapped to the side of it because you're going to need it. If you run heavy equipment and don't seed, unless you're putting gravel over everything and making a driveway and you're not creating any bare soil next to the driveway, you need seed. And you need a lot of it. It's good. We like to seed lightly and often. We'll seed most swales 3 to 10 times because one seeding won't just get it all going unless you get perfect weather. And the best time to do these systems, all of these earthworks, is in the early spring. These are 3 ponds I built this spring, looking northeast from our site in Rochester in the North Hollow. And this was done in June, and by late July, this was all greened up. Billions of clover coming up and vetch, turnips, radish. We have we call it the master mix of seed that we make up, 10 to 20 species, and we just spread it around whenever we create bare soil. And then oftentimes we'll mulch it. Not always, but usually. It's best practice to mulch it with hay after, straw, not so much in Vermont. This winter, this is like 3 weeks ago before we started getting snow. This is that same swale you just saw photos of. Planted with apples, this one is, with cages around it. And then we're going to replant this. We're going to add the understory this spring. We're planting about 5,000 plus trees there on this property this spring. It'll be, I think, the largest agroecological planting in, probably New England, definitely Vermont. As far as I know, this spring we're going to stitch plants up every few feet. We'll have a plant for another 10,000 feet of swales or so on this property. So you can see right here, we can actually flood these swales from ponds. These are those ponds I just showed a photo of before. We can actually empty these ponds, or the top foot or two, into these swales during the dry part of June and July and August, when there's water in the ponds because of springs, but no water in the dry hayfield. That's a keyline strategy. That's the idea of spreading excess water from where it's abundant to where there's a lack of, which means taking water from the valleys and putting that water on the ridges. That's part of the essence of what keyline agriculture is. Very important. P.A. Yeomans also articulated that. Maybe in some ways invented that. Probably didn't invent that idea. The Mayans and other cultures, I'm sure, have done that, but he formally articulated it. Such a basic idea, but yet so brilliant, and something we don't understand or see enough in our landscape. Here's another example of what's happening on our 10-acre site, how we actually fertilize and irrigate at the same time. This is taken from my book, and it's well explained in here. So in the interest of time, I won't go through this, but basically we absorb all of our water from uphill. We store the water, any water that flows out of the swales, we store in ponds. We take that water and we siphon it to small pools where we allow access for ducks. And sometimes we'll actually take burlap bags full of manure from the barn in the winter, sink them in there, make these kind of crazy manure tea little pools, and then we'll siphon gravity feed out of those pools into our rice paddies and also water perennials or even annuals in. Basically a form of gravity feeding manure tea across the landscape. And that's really how these systems should be set up from scratch. We only learned to do this because we made rice paddies and we started flood irrigating the rice from the pond, and then we realized, wait a minute, we could fertilize, inject this at the same time. It's kind of like what it's almost a primitive version of like a modern fertility injected system looks like. But it's done in a way that's unbreakable. I mean, you get 1/2 inch or 3/4 poly tubing, keep it out of the sun, it's there for a long, long time. There's no pump needed. It's an unbreakable system. As long as the force of gravity works, this will happen for you. This is making rice paddies. I'll just click through these real quick so you can see the process. We do a lot of tours on the property, so people come to help us plant our rice crop because they want to learn what's involved. This is a group from Yestermorrow that came out. We're planting our rice here. This is when it starts to flower in July. It's what it looks like starting to be later in the season. You get 5,000 pounds of rice per acre. It's double the terrestrial yield of most grain, yet you can grow it on subsoil. There's no topsoil here. We dug these paddies, we're growing it in the fertility of the water. So and that's what's so interesting about it. The rice is kind of cool, but the paddies, the fact that you can grow a crop in a fertility accumulating system, not a fertility losing system, in a depression, not a convex system like a row that's always losing. Our vegetable gardens, where we grow most of our veggies, they're always losing. We always have to bring compost back to them. Not the rice paddies. They're actually gaining. Think about how wetlands accrue fertility. When you mine out an old wetland, it's accrued fertility for hundreds or thousands of years, like old peat bogs and wetlands. This is what's happening naturally here. It's a sink. It's a deposition zone. Rice just happens to be a species that can take inundation and grow in these nutrient accumulating parts of the landscape. So this is one of our ducks, Coco Chanel, and one of her babies. She's been a really good mother, and we've been integrating ducks and rice, which is a very old form of agriculture, for the last few years. It's hard to get the timing just right. Again, it's all about timing with so many of these systems. But has anyone read The Power of Duck? Heard of it? It's about how ducklings, essentially ducks and rice, are probably this co-evolved system. The rice is too high in silica for ducklings to digest. So they cruise through the paddies when the rice is just establishing it without knocking the rice over or touching it, and they eat all the weeds and poop those weeds out, fertilizing the rice. Perfect system, right? Really, if half of our systems were half this perfect, we'd be totally silent. Right? This is an old form. This is an old system we've inherited. This is partly the result probably of breeding and of really getting super sophisticated with integrated agriculture. Really neat to see that happen. I'll point out here, I'd be remiss to not point out that food is one thing, being fed is one thing. That's an important part of a resilient lifestyle, a secure, food security. But staying warm is, in some ways even more important. This is a good winter to talk about this, because this is what it does around here pretty much every winter. It gets 20 degrees below zero without the wind chill, right? We don't count wind chill in Vermont. That's for like people in Washington, D.C. or something, right? It doesn't count, right? It's cold. It's real cold up here. So we need to stay warm if you don't want your house freezing and water flowing everywhere once the power comes back on. And there's nothing that compares with cordwood in a cold, cloudy climate with wood as a heating source. People may get all excited about pellets or solar, this or that, but the fact is we don't get much sun in a good chunk of the winter. Until February comes around in most of New England, it's not too sunny. And what's reliable is burning the stored sunlight in the form of wood. And so from a resiliency standpoint, I would put out there that we all need a source of wood heat if you live in this climate. And you got to also know how to use these systems really well. What we are able to do is basically heat 1,500 square feet of home on a cord of wood. Does anyone heat with wood? Right? That's a pretty low amount of use. Now, our home's really well insulated. That's a big part of it. But we also burn the wood very well. And I would emphasize here that drying wood is key for that. I drive all around Vermont. I've done like almost 200 site consults around the state. I get to see what people are doing. And most of the time I see people slowly rotting wood. You ever see a stack of wood and people tarp it when they get it? That's a great way to grow mushrooms, right? Tarp wood that's already loaded with moisture against the ground, which is not dry. And our ground is never dry, at least not more than a handful of inches down. You want it to get sunshine, you want it to get air, and you want it to not have rain going onto it. So a shed that gets good exposure and good wind flow, or just scrap plywood and scrap roofing is what we use. It's easy, it's cheap, it's fast. You'll get really dry wood, and then every ounce of water that you're boiling off of the cordwood, the less water you boil out. Because if any moisture in your cordwood has to boil off, sucking heat. If you remember back to like 7th or 8th grade physics, when you boil water, it's a huge energy sink. The less water you're boiling, the better. Wood is very wet. It holds moisture better than anything in this climate, right? Wood. It's over 100% by weight water, usually when it's cut. It takes a full growing season to dry if you're drying it in good conditions. We dry it very, very well, and then we burn it in our buildings. Here's just some examples of very durable, resilient infrastructures. A SketchUp drawing of our design studio here. Again, heats on 1,500 on 1 cord of wood. You see the wood drying there. Tall, narrow stacks off the ground. It's timber framed, all from wood from the property. Won't last as long as our earthworks, but it should last a while. We use it as support for our food system, for hardy kiwis. Some other shots of our infrastructure here. Our greenhouse we built last year with our Jean Pain composting mound, where we're, as manure and wood chips rot, it is heating our greenhouse with tubes that you circulate water through. Just some other infrastructure shots here, and I'll get back to what I was chatting about. This is a barn we just built down in Rochester. Should be around for the long haul. When you go to build a building, you're going to use a lot of energy. It's going to take all your time and then some, and it's going to be a huge expense. And I think the best way to approach it is to build it for the long haul. So you have to build it, again, as few times as possible, or work on it, or renovate it, or fix it as few times as possible. It's not a living system. It's not accruing value. The second you finish a built system or a piece of technology, it starts to fall apart. So best to make it as durable as possible. It's not increasing in complexity and order and robustness like when you plant a tree, you walk away, that tree is getting, if it's an oak or a pine nut, it's accruing value for 400 years. Buildings aren't like that, at least not until we're a whole nother level of species that we can make living buildings. This is how we burn our wood, multiple functions from single expenditures, right? Here's a single system, our wood stove, but we cook on it, we bake in it, we get firelight off of it, it dries all sorts of stuff from apples to herbs, medicinal herbs, to also cordwood if stuff got a little wet in the pile. It also heats all of our hot water, enough hot water for 2 people to shower or bathe extravagantly every day for free, just as a matter of course, while we're also heating 1,500 square feet. Amazing how cheap this is the most bang for the buck anyone could do in their home. We've basically, if we were buying our wood, which we're not, we'd be spending $400. We're up to now 2 cords since we're heating our hot water. That takes almost a cord by itself on a cold winter. So if we were buying wood, we'd be spending, let's say, $400 for all of our heat and all of our hot water and most of our cooking for a whole year. Now, I don't know what your bills are in this climate, but most people spend like $2,000–3,000 on that. The guy, a neighbor who gave us this electric hot water tank, gave it away because probably couldn't afford or didn't want to keep paying what was over $1,000 a year just to heat his hot water. Forget heating his place, because an electric hot water heater, it was still good. It didn't leak, so we just plumbed it to our wood stove, and it thermosiphons, no pump, heats our hot water. We have a video on this online so people can see if you're interested in how this works. We also experiment with growing our firewood, because just having firewood be produced randomly in a woodlot is fine if you have a big woodlot, but we're on 10 acres with immature forest. With heating a bunch of different buildings, that's not necessarily a sustainable supply of wood, even if we do it really well and with really insulated buildings. So how do you turn as much carbon into firewood as possible on a site? There's one species that does it better than anything else in this climate. Anyone know what that might be? There's 50 trees of them. Black locust, yeah. It's just the fastest way to turn carbon from the atmosphere and put it into soil and into lignin and cellulose into a usable form. It grows as fast as poplar or birch, or even faster, almost as fast as a hybrid poplar, but it's as dense as white oak and hickory. Total anomaly, right? Nothing's like that. If something grows fast, it's like pretty shitty wood usually, right? If like poplar, that's not great wood. Willow, it's not dense. It's not good firewood. Here's something that's like a fast-growing hickory, very fast-growing on hickory on steroids, or a white oak, hyperdrive white oak. We grow them on swales in a grazing system, of course, always integrated, and we graze these systems, and then we harvest firewood on the mounds. We're about 6 years into this, so we're at the point where we have valuable fence posts. Black oak is also the most drought-resistant wood probably you can grow here. So just by itself, that's an enormous value, because there's not a lot of rot-resistant species we can grow here, especially super rot-resistant like black locust. Here's Mark Shepard when he visited our place looking up at our alders. He was just thinking, this is cool, but you need 10,000 of these. He does it at pretty large scale. This is black locust as well, being grazed. The sheep love them. They're very high. The leaves are very high in protein. Leguminous leaves, it's fixing nitrogen also. It's a gift of the gods plant. It's incredible. It's also edible. There's 101 uses for black locust. You can eat the flowers. They say you can raise more honey on an acre of black locust than anything else. I don't know if it's true, but even if it's up there, just another reason to plant black locust. This is our leach field. We experiment with growing on that. Most productive spot on most properties. You might as well grow more than a lawn with it, right? Look at that productivity. We do a lot of different things to establish systems on poor sites. Foliar feeding is one of them. Very low tech. These things can last a while, and you can get a tree established that otherwise would take a lot of mulching or would even be very difficult to do. Once it's established, you don't need to do this foliar feeding forever. It starts, you get a soil ecosystem going, the plant gets established, gets strong, starts to perpetuate its own needs. Our animal systems are getting more extensive over the years, although goats were one way we went that we realized, nope, goat's the opposite of a tree, so we want to grow a lot of trees, got to watch out for goats, right? Plus, they steal the show, and everyone else, all the other animals don't like them because they're just like the center of attention. The sheep, the sheep are like, come on, why don't you pay attention to us here a little bit? And the dog, too. But they're everyone's best friend, except, again, for your favorite trees. They know which ones are your favorite. So if you like trees, which we do, you got a tough time with goats. Not that they don't have a role, especially in like early on system establishment. If you're converting old field, goats and pigs, those are two real system establishment species. Ducks have been a favorite of ours. They love white clover, and white clover also grows a lot of slugs. And we love white clover because it's a fantastic way to establish after a bare soil being made. This is a pond berm they're on when you make swales. This is Mr. McDuckles, who we had a couple years ago. We had to get him out of our cabbage patch at this moment. He was coming in there to eat some of our cabbage. So they have challenges. They need to be managed. We find we can keep them managed with 12 to 18 inches of fence. People come out, they're like, what are all these little things you're trying to trip me with? What are all these little stupid fences? They must not be able to keep anything out. They keep our ducks managed. Could the ducks fly over? Sure, the ducks could fly over to Warren or Waitsfield if they wanted to. But they don't because they're creatures of habit like most animals, and the fences just guide them. And also, we're around a lot. I wouldn't leave a system like that. I wouldn't do my cows that way and have 30 acres that way and them get out. But if you're in zone 1 and 2, you can manage. We try to do the least amount of effort for the maximum amount of result, right? Everything, how lazy of a system can you make and still have it work? That's kind of partly how to approach these things. There's Jangles and Akira with one of our new rams a few years ago. We sometimes milk the sheep when we have in the past when it's the right time. This is our intensive rotational grazing shot of just what you want when you're grazing animals. You don't want to graze low plants. You want to graze high plants. Bring it down pretty low and then give it a real rest. The timing there is key. We graze everything. This is head cut off by mistake. Sheep. We're moving away from sheep toward cows because sheep, as anyone keeps sheep, they kind of have a lot of needs at times. So they've been a little bit high maintenance. I mean, they're great, but the fencing also is much greater need than with cows. So we're going to try moving towards larger grazing animals, see how that goes, especially with our other piece of land that's a larger scale. Hazelnuts have been great. Bur oaks, a very fast-growing nut tree. Anyone know what this is? Hawthorn, yeah. Fantastic medicine, very powerful medicine we all used to have in our yards when we lived in Europe, or those of us that in a past life or in our ancestors did. They grow up, they're weedy, they grow up everywhere now. You can put pears right on them, so you can create a deer-proof pear orchard right off the bat if you have hawthorns. Just graft them above browse line and you have an insta-pear. You can do this with a bunch of different species. We grow a lot of shiitake. Low value, great way to add value to low value pole wood like red maple. Many species you can actually grow shiitake on. We find sugar maple's the best. 30% protein, super loaded with micronutrients. It's really a food medicine. It's really both. You dry them. You want to dry them gills face up. It's a great way. Working with mycelium is a great way of transforming a lower value form of life or material into higher order, higher complexity form of life, right? Mycelium is to soil, and fungi is to soil as plants are to wood chips as plants are to soil, right? That's how we transform woody debris into life and value, is using mycelium and fungi. Same way we use plants to transform soil into value. Wine caps Strafari have been great for us. We've sold a bunch of that locally. At different times, it comes and goes throughout our property. Oyster mushrooms have been great. We're starting to get honey from the land, which is amazing. You start to actually get the kind of nectar feeding off of the flowers of the plants you planted. It's really a neat full circle. that's been coming on in the last couple of years. We had morels one year from what we established, but they didn't come back. Just some of the shots of what's on our farm here. This is like late March, a good example of what we're eating now. 10 years in now, we're starting to realize when we look at a plate of food that most of what's on that plate, most of the time, is from within 100 yards of where we're eating. And it's interesting how that creeps up. In the last couple years, I've started to realize when I go into the Hunger Mountain Co-op in Montpelier, I can walk through the produce department, but I don't need anything there. I mean, sure, there might be something I want that we don't have, but it's like, well, I've got 100 pounds of something else that's similar to that in the root cellar. And it's neat how that kind of catches up with you. It accumulates. And it's really amazing because there's nothing more affordable than keeping a vegetable garden. I mean, just pull it back to very simple things. All these different things I'm saying are great. All of the intentional, very complex agroecosystems. But just keeping a vegetable garden, just from an affordability standpoint, is the easiest. It's the easiest bang for the buck anyone could do. You will save thousands of dollars in your first year if you do it well and have a bit of sunny land. There's our lamb sausage here, our potatoes, our jalapenos, our greens, sauerkraut, kimchi, garlic. We grow more of that every year. It's hard. It's kind of crazy not to grow garlic because it's just too easy to do. I mean, it's so easy to propagate. If there's one plant we should be growing, all should probably grow some of it's garlic. It's very powerful medicine, powerful antibiotic. It's so easy on the soil. It's so easy to perpetuate and actually breed yourself on site by saving bulbs. It's really just kind of a no-brainer. Some of our fresh salads throughout most of the year, now with a greenhouse throughout the whole year. Shiitake mushrooms, duck eggs, honeyberry, which is the earliest fruit in the year. We're planting hundreds of these. They're called haskaps in Canada. They're the earliest nectar source in Zone 1. They're hardy to, so if the global ocean conveyor belt stops or some kind of crazy stuff happens, honeyberry is a big hedge, right? They're hardy literally to Zone 1, I think, Zone 2. They fruit earlier than strawberries. And they're really, really tasty. They're like a blueberry when you let them mature, a little tartar. So really high in anthocyanins and phytochemicals, really good. They're food and they're medicine. Sylvetta arugula is a big favorite of ours. There's our garlic crop, some of it, right? I mean, end here on the medicinal piece, because staying fed is one thing. Staying healthy is going to be a whole nother challenge, probably much more difficult, right? Because we just, one example of this, forget the coal, forget everything else, we got 104 of these scary red dots just in this country alone. Anyone know what these are? Yeah, there's a nearly out of control, waiting to get out of control chain reaction happening at every one of these spots. And without continual energy input and vigilance at these places for hundreds of years, there's a catastrophe, right? So probably there'll be more. Unfortunately, we just built these 40, 50 years ago. They're just nearing the end of their lifespan. One crazy gamble we made to just hurl a bunch of craziness into the future for a few thousand years that we decided to do in the wake of World War II with World War II technology, right? So we're going to feel that we're just starting to feel the wakes of that impact. We will be feeling the impacts of this experiment for literally at least 1,000 years or more, unless there's some miracle, which is a slim bet. The attacks on the human cellular health will be continuing for a very long time. So focusing on the medicinal piece is really important. And that's where we're moving in the last couple of years. This is a giant reishi mushroom that my wife and I found a couple of years ago, actually just a year ago. Probably the biggest mushroom on reishi I'll ever find in this lifetime, just amazing. We're really working with the plants and fungi that promote health as intensely as possible, that are most potent. Food is one thing. Powerful medicinal quality produce from the land is a whole nother. And that, unfortunately, will be a growth industry. As long as toxicity is a growth industry, preventative medicine will be a growth industry as well, especially as we're wrapping our heads around the values of this. This is reishi, turkey tail, chaga, which we have on the wood stove all winter long and drink, at least weekly. It's a major health tonic, anti-carcinogen, especially the turkey tail. They're adaptogenic. Here's some of what other medicine looks like. Anyway, it's kind of amazing that we think of medicine today. It's an indication of where we're at health-wise. We think of medicine as those things, artificially colored capsules, right? That's medicine. Well, medicine looks like this, right? Medicine, actually, preventative medicine is beautiful. I mean, it's always beautiful, preventative medicine, and that's kind of interesting to realize that what helps provide us with health is looks beautiful in the landscape and looks beautiful in its processing. Anyone know what these are? Milky oats, yeah, great medicine. Way to turn oats, actually use oats medicinally. Sea berry is one of our favorite medicinals. Aronia, blackberry, elder. Just a quick tour through some of the medicines that we're working with. Sea berry, again, probably our favorite one. It's a nitrogen-fixing medicinal berry. So it's hard not to drink gallons of this stuff. But 1 teaspoon a day is therapeutic, loaded with essential fatty acids. It's been a favorite medicinal for hundreds, if not thousands of years in Northern Europe. It's apparently endangered in Hungary because people wildcraft this so heavily. We're planting them by the hundreds. Again, they're a nitrogen-fixing shrub. They're like elderberry, but they fix nitrogen, and they're orange. They're loaded with bioflavonoids and essential fatty acids. My wife, who's a naturopath and really great herbalist, thinks there's not enough research on them, but she thinks that it might be a more powerful tonic and health-maintaining plant than elderberry. And elderberry is very powerful, strong antiviral. So we try to not drink all of this every day, but we drink a lot of it. They're great for salves. I mean, the industry for sea berry is mainly for, which is crazy, is for skin. It's amazing because of essential fatty acids and high-end skincare. But it's that's nice, but it's so valuable to take internally. I can't imagine. We do make some salve because we have a lot. We grow more sea berry now than anyone we know of in the United States, and certainly I think in New England. We're big on this plant. But in Canada, they grow them by the tens of thousands. They're already way up on sea berry as a prairie restoration, a prairie windbreak. They're Siberian. They naturalize on sand dunes in Siberia. So they're salt tolerant, zone 2 hardy, honey badger types of plants. This is dried, just incredible. We get a lot of peaches on some years, plums. These are fun. They have some health values, but they're also a lot more finicky. They're good to contrast with sea berry, right? This is some of the nutrients we harvest now. And we think about it from a standpoint of nutrients. We look too much at weight, at poundage of produce, at calories of produce. But if you look at it nutrient-wise, this is thousands of pounds worth of nutrients if you are trying to get this out of like lower value foods. Like, has anyone heard how now we need 40 apples to equal the nutrients that is in 1 apple of our grandparents because of what was in the soil? Right, so we think about growing nutrients. We have to think very carefully about how we remineralize our soils and also about what we grow. Again, just food being one thing, nutrients being another. And some plants accrue nutrients a lot better than others. There's a bowl full of nutrients, and they also taste really good. This fall, hardy kiwi, which we grow right up our studio, plums, akebia, which are really neat. You spoon them out, they're like custard. Hardy kiwi dried. Now, processing is the bottleneck with all this stuff, right? It's one thing to grow it all. What we're having challenges with in the last couple of years is like dealing in August, September, and October. That's where it comes to this, you're getting this over-yielding system. And so that's where the bottleneck is with it. It becomes a real processing challenge. And as we see, even in the local organic farming and food system, our bottleneck is processing in Vermont, more than production, although we have a long way to go in terms of production as well. This is dried kiwi, dried apples up in the rafters. Elderberry, we make them into tinctures as well. We sell some of this stuff on our website, by the way. I'll mention at the end. Sauerkraut, food medicine, some others. This is what the pantry starts to be filled with. So I'll just end on this note, right? This is really what I'm realizing is a way of crafting an ecosystem. We think of craft as what we do on the built end of things, right? This is a stone wall, a stone bridge made by hand in Hillsborough, New Hampshire, made before the fossil fuel era in the 1800s, that is outlasting bridges we made in the cheap energy era 40 years ago, which are already falling down, and this is going strong, might live another 100 or 400 or 500 years. But it was built with a high level of skill. It was a work of craft. That's what we're talking about on the living systems front, on the biological front. So you can think of the row of tilled vegetables as something very powerful and quick, like something we do with an abundance of fossil fuel. But if we're in it for the long haul, we have to think in terms of level of craft. I think most of the long-term values we're talking about here are intergenerational, right? Because what we're talking about right now, the de facto plan is we'll live on eating electronics, right? We'll just somehow subsist like Wall-E on electronic pollution, right? Well, if we want to leave our kids with persimmons, which seem preferable to eat, then the iPhone, just live on endocrine disruptors. That'd be pretty sweet. We got to be in it for the long haul. We have to establish these systems intergenerationally. Most of the highest yields don't come in year 1, in year 5. We're not even there yet. We're 10 years in. This is a planted chestnut forest above the Aegean Sea. This is planted for the kids, for the grandkids, for the great-grandkids. You can't compare its outputs, right? The value of its outputs far exceed what we could ever get out of an annual plant. But you don't get them overnight. So we have to be in it for the long haul and think, in that intergenerational perspective. Here's pine nuts, right? They'll bear for 400 years. In the millions of acres of taiga where shamanic tradition has emerged for thousands of years, where these trees are existing, where they actually have a culture. This is their totem tree, like coconut is to Polynesia. They say how they start ringing in 500 years, and that's right, and they're ready to be cut down. This is intensely loaded with fat, with high nutrient fats, essential fatty acids, and protein. They'll bear for 400 years, but they don't start bearing for 10 or 20 or 30, right? That's kind of how it goes. The most worthwhile things take the longest to establish. So right now we have a window to establish these systems. Here's chestnuts. These are all from a farm in Vermont near Nico Rubin's, a guy who had the foresight to plant these systems 20 years ago. Hopefully we'll have these yields in the coming few years, maybe 3 to 5 years. But all the talk about it is nice, all the blogging, all the books, but none of it matters unless we get our hands dirty, get the shovels in the ground, get the seeds, get the plants, and really start planting up our systems with hundreds and thousands of plants. All these principles are only good if we actually take them to heart and get down and dirty. If you're interested in more, we have our permaculture design courses. We have 2 this summer. We might offer a 3rd because the 2 are almost full. They're in July and August. They're a great opportunity. We eat really great food. We eat mostly, this year will be mostly food from the property, from our second property. We go through the entire design process. That is permaculture design. It's very hands-on. It's much less academic than most permaculture courses, than any one I know of, actually. We do a lot of skills immersion. Jeff Lawton came by when we were teaching our second one this year. And it's also just a whole lot of fun. We do a lot of harvesting, seed saving. We do intensive workshops throughout. We plant systems. We dig swales. We practice sharpening, go through the design process, present designs, camp on site, beautiful places, enjoy the area, do a lot of swimming, hanging out, and we also have tours of our farm pretty often. Check our book out for more information. I have a couple copies here. It's also down at the Chelsea Green booth, and our website has a lot more information, our Facebook page as well. I'll hang out for a little while for questions, but thanks for listening right now. Appreciate it.